Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Truth is Lacking. I'm sitting down again with my friend, Professor Mike Tricoli. We're gonna go over some things again. We've had some great feedback from folks, and we want to cover some more of these things a little more in depth. So, if you would you give us kind of an overview, Mike, of what you're going to go through, and then delve into it?
Well, we've done a couple videos already, and I'd like to review what we've done in the previous videos. And a lot of this is talking about brain functioning and different modes of therapy and how to make that real. And Shane and I had discussions about how do we present this to people who will understand it. And there's so much technical stuff behind the scenes that goes behind these discussions. To present this as something that people understand, that's my goal. That's our goal. Yeah. So I'd like to go back to the cognitive behavioral therapy and the dialectical behavioral therapy and those modes of therapy, and then go from there with this next series of videos.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Delve into it.
So basically, I'm going to go back to this brain functioning. I'm going to give a basic overview with a little extra in there about how our minds work. And it starts with drawing a picture.
And if you remember from the previous videos, Mike is a terrific artist.
I do my best, and I'm going to have to go over it a couple times and make sure it... Uh-oh, something's wrong here.
There we go.
Okay, so this is a brain, okay? And our brain has different sections to it. Lobes or areas of our brain that have jobs. And our jobs, the brain does certain jobs. This structure does that job, that structure does that job. And when one structure suffers, others can compensate. But for the most part, what I'm going to give is a general idea of different brain sections and what their jobs are, and how that is relevant to our behaviors and our reactions to stressors in our life. And so when we go through the brain sections, I'm going to go very basic, and we're going to call this the front brain. And mostly this is the prefrontal cortex. But we're going to call this the front brain. And this is the prefrontal cortex. We have here, we're going to call this the back brain. And this is the occipital lobe, it's the cerebellum, it's some of the brain stem area back here. And there are bands in the brain. And what I'm drawing in a very rudimentary way are the bands. And the bands control electrical activity. This is the midbrain, back brain. Electrical activity dictates where blood flows. And we know when we see the electrical activity move around in the brain through different brain imaging studies, so this is all based on brain imaging studies, we know what are the active parts of the brain. And so CBT is the new therapy. In the last video I kind of explained that. It has become more and more based on brain functioning and how our brain functions. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. Aaron Beck is the founder of it. Began in the 1950s. Really took off the late 1980s and 90s, and now it is used across the world. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Built off there is electrical behavioral therapy. But back to CBT. CBT tells us we need to understand our minds to really understand pathologies. And we have the prefrontal cortex here, which is the front brain. And we have the midbrain. The front brain's job is to allow us intellectual thought. It is the critical thinking part of the brain. It's executive function is what they call it. And a lot of the prefrontal cortex, but the full cortex runs through here, really controls our intellect. So we have to be there during times when we need to make decisions in our lives. Critical decisions, important decisions. In the midbrain, we're dealing a lot with the limbic system. A little bit of a brainstem is in there. And the limbic system is a lot of our emotions, our passions, a lot of our instincts. And this is where we go when we need fight or flight. We have the amygdalas in here. And again, I explained these earlier. I'm not going to go over them again. Hippocampus is in there. We have the other structures in there that our mind goes to when we're passionate and when we're emotional and when we're in danger. The rear brain, there isn't going to be much of this discussion because we're talking about, even when you head up here to the parental lobes and stuff, we're talking more about the sensory. And then back here at brainstem, we're talking about life itself. And if you lose this, you're done. So a lot of our discussion is right here. Front brain, midbrain. And CBT has a couple of different terms I want to define again for us. We're sitting here in our front brain right now, most of our day. And our day has to be based on intellectual decision making. And this is what helps us be successful in life when we see that we're front-brained and our 2 + 2 = 4. Our critical thinking skills are there, deductive reasoning are there. Something happens to us where we're here and suddenly we go midbrain.
Is that what you called a trigger?
That's it. You remember.
Trigger.
And CBT, we'll call that triggers. And when I was trained in CBT, triggers, we discussed triggers all the time. And really that is part of CBT, the essence of CBT. Because now once you're triggered, now there's different types of reasons and different ways that people become triggered. There's numerous types of triggers, and what triggers you may not trigger me, but a trigger is something that puts you midbrain, which means the wrong part of your brain is now making decisions because you need to be intelligent during these times. Midbrain, people go there when they're in danger and they need to just run. 2 + 2 no longer equals 4 when you need to run or fight. And so most of the time we don't need to go midbrain. But something happens, we go midbrain, we don't need to be there. Now we have a task. Now we have to go from the limbic system back up to the prefrontal cortex. And we have to do another term that CBT has for us. We have to cope. So we have to cope now because we've gone midbrain. And we can't stay midbrain. Now they know people with personality disorders, and let's just say people are really struggling in life. Once they're triggered, they're easier triggered than most. Once they're triggered, it's so much harder to cope and go back to front brain. So they spend more time here. And they suffer because they're spending time here. Now, DBT takes all this and goes a step further, and I'll get to that in a minute. DBT tells us, works off of this, how to identify when that occurs. When someone's stuck in their midbrain and they can't get out. But CBT is all about, let's identify triggers, let's identify coping. And triggers are sometimes, people are easier triggered because their general anxiety is too high. And so what might not be a trigger one day for someone is a trigger another day because they're already escalating in anxiety. Coping may be more difficult if there's been numerous triggers built on top of each other.
With all the stresses of life and the busyness of life, we can very easily stay in a heightened anxiety type of level, which would make these triggers happen more quickly, more difficult to cope.
Yes.
Thus, relationships being damaged.
And so what we're talking about here is, I mentioned anxiety dial with previous discussions, and I went into the DBT, emotional regulations, and how that looks as you're escalating in life. So now we have someone who's heightened anxiety and they're stuck in the midbrain, and DBT addresses that. And DBT goes into it. Now I want something to be very clear about this video, and this is not just me talking. This has been established later in life. This isn't just for people with disabilities. This is for everybody.
Yeah.
These kind of discussion, this discussion we're having right now is for everybody. Let's understand something. We need to be mindful and understanding of how we respond to the world around us and how the world around us is responding to us. And we need to understand that when we're triggered, we need to cope. Every aspect of life. Now that's talk therapy. And DBT is one step beyond CBT, and at least DBT came a little later. And DBT is, I say, it would be considered fully biblical. DBT has got 4 principles and begins with mindfulness. And mindfulness is a fantastic concept. There's other therapies that have mindfulness as well. Emotional intelligence always talks about mindfulness, but mindfulness is really one of the most effective things I've ever discussed with people before. I talk with students, I mentor them, and I ask them sometimes, what has been the most helpful thing? They say, great, the discussions we had are awesome. Tell me the most helpful thing, mindfulness. Frequently they jump right into mindfulness. Now from there you have emotional regulations, you have de-stress management, effective interpersonal relationships. Those are the 4 principles of DBT, and often we'll throw in there conflict resolution because people often want to go into, let's talk about conflict resolutions. So that's CBT and into DBT. There's one aspect of DBT. Now all this is, let's talk about therapy. One aspect of DBT, which is de-stress management, which I'm going to go into more detail in the next video.
Okay.
And I'm going to add to that. Because DBT and CBT are fantastic, and that's all we've talked about so far with all the videos, if that's all you need. Sitting down talking about these things and understanding, look, my brain functions a certain way, And I have to make sure I need to be where I am the most effective throughout my day. If I'm in some massive fight of some kind, which doesn't happen often, I hope, yes, there's some use for midbrain, but it's always controlled with front brain. And the most successful people in the world know how to control all this passion and energy with their front brain, with their intellect. Athletes are like that. And so we understand that that alone is mindfulness right there. Being mindful of our behaviors.
That's excellent. That's excellent.
So that's a good starting point.
Yeah, thank you for helping to recap this, to put the original 2 videos that we did kind of in a nutshell. So if you didn't catch those first 2, they're on the channel there. One is how do our minds function, and it talks about triggers, anxiety, and coping. The second one is building psychological resilience, where as Mike was talking about, going to the DBT. Now we're going to look further into this in a following video, but this was to serve as a recap of those things as we delve in deeper into the next 2 videos. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. See you in the next one.